Welcome to another episode of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. I'm your host, Dr. Valerie Nyberg, and I am so very happy to welcome Dr. Becky Thompson to our episode today. Hi. Um,
Hi.
to
You're great,
introduce,
Valerie. You're great.
well, thank you. To introduce you all to her, I'm going to go through her bio. Dr. Thompson has a BA from the University of California at Santa Cruz with a major in sociology with a minor in women's studies. Her master's and PhD were from Brandeis University. As a Rockefeller Fellow, Becky completed her postdoctoral work at Princeton University in African American Studies, which I'm so jealous of. She is also a trained yoga instructor, which took place in the United States, Greece, and Bali. For 2021, she earned an MFA in creative writing with a focus on poetry at Stone Coast in Maine. And she is a scholar, poet, and activist. Her
Mhm.
poetry collections include To Speak in Salt and Zero is a Hole I Fall Into at Night. Her two edited volumes of poetry include Making Mirrors, Writing and Writing by and for Refugees with Palestinian poet Johan Bassiso, and Fingernails Across the Chalkboard, Poetry and Pose on HIV/AIDS from the Black Diaspora, co-edited with Randall Horton. Her scholarly books include Teaching with Tenderness, which is how I found her and,
Mhm.
reached out to her, Survivors on the Yoga Mat, When the Center is on Fire, and A Promise and a Way of Life, and several other volumes. She has held appointments at many well-known universities, including Duke, Wesleyan, and University of Massachusetts, to name a few, as well as others throughout the world, and has earned recognition for her poetry, writing, and teaching. Becky teaches yoga in Boston and internationally in places like Greece, Thailand, and China. She brings to the classroom a feminist pedagogy that rests on encouraging students to think reflectively about their how their intersecting identities shape their outlook. She sees the work of teachers as companions, not authorities. Feminists, feminist embodied pedagogy allows teachers to trust students' experience and awareness as they create expansive context for deep learning, which is why we are having this lovely conversation today. So, welcome, Dr. Thompson, to our conversation and to Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. You are a true find, and I'm so grateful that you are with me today. Thank you so much for agreeing.
Thank you for inviting me.
I just want to invite you to share a little bit about your story and how you have started your journey and landed, to this space and place today.
Mhm.
Whatever you feel comfortable sharing.
Well, I'd say one thing is that I don't think that we're in charge of a lot of where we end up. Some of the work is to try to be as gracious as possible with where we find ourselves.
Mhm.
And in my case, having been raised up really through multiracial feminism,
Mhm.
through the work of Cherie Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa and Barbara Smith and Angela Davis and Ellie Bolkin and many other brave women in the late 1970s and early 1980s that I think had a huge impact on how I've lived my life since then.
Mhm.
And the main thing I got from that teaching early on is that I don't have the right to call myself a feminist unless I also have an anti-racist vision. And
Mm.
that means looking at the whole world in a different kind of way. So I really want to give props to particularly the women of color over the years who've been patient with me and included me in many conversations and who are now providing the guidance really all over the world to turn around this madness that we're watching.
I appreciate you saying that because I so often feel like that acknowledgement goes unstated and
Mhm.
unrecognized. So I'm gonna probe a little bit. When you say see the world in a different kind of way, can you unpack that just a little bit? So like, can you
Well,
give us a window for from like childhood to finding out about these scholars, like what, how your perspective changed?
I guess an example that comes to me right off the bat is that I grew up in Tempe, Arizona, in a Mexican neighborhood and on native land, and was deeply influenced by the wisdom and the knowledge and the art of Navajo and Hopi. And growing up in Arizona, that's all native and Chicano country, right? But it wasn't until I came to Brandeis and saw a movie called Broken Rainbow
Mm,
about the forced relocation of 10,000 Hopi and Navajo in the Four Corners region of the US that I even had a beginning sense of all that had been going on there. Like I sensed it as a sensitive child, but I didn't have the data. And
mm,
that, I come from a Mormon family. So my great great grandfather had 9 wives, right? I come from a polygamous white supremacist culture that took over not just one tract of land for a wife, but all those tracts of land, who stole that land. So just where I was born tells me a lot about the work that I need to do in terms of standing up against colonialism.
mhm.
So, an immediate connection then is when Israel and the United States are now trying to decimate all of Gaza and maybe the West Bank too. I already have a lot of the language to understand that settler colonialism has a deep history in the US, and it is very much tied with slavery. And so, my work as somebody who is white is to speak openly about my complicity in that and to try to change the story of what it means to be white in those spaces.
That gives a, I think that gives a beautiful example because I think as a person who understood that they grew up on native land, one would say that you were probably very astute and felt that you were very culturally competent coming into the world. But when you went to Brandeis and saw how um, Native American peoples were went through a genocide in this country and were removed, and the factors that took place in that process and why that happened and how that happened and the narratives that were told to us as a result of that happening in all of the economic processes that came about as a result of that happening, you began to see a whole mechanism that opened your perspective to a much wider understanding of systems, understanding of why slavery happened, the way it happened, and how the narrative got spun about it, and the perpetuation of using bodies in the way that we've come to use them, and telling the stories about Black and brown people the way that we have come to accept those narratives the way that we do, and that perpetuation out into the world as the United States as the place of democracy, the virtuistic uh, candle flame holder of democracy, going out into the world and saving other folks uh, as we do, um, for our for our righteousness of now transmuting this across the world in this very particular way. Would that sum it up?
Yeah, so and I'd say it's not really about saving the world, it's about bombing the rest of the world.
Right, right.
I
No,
mean,
and it's about
who's
it's
providing the bombs and the artillery to for this genocide, for example, is the US, yeah.
right. And I would actually say bombing, but more of a it's about creating an ever opening market of the rest of the world. And if they don't comply, that's when the bombing part of that comes into play. But we
Yeah.
do digress.
So I'm thinking about Adrienne Rich, the poet and the essayist and the white anti-racist activist, who described historical amnesia as
Mhm.
the imagination's sugar rush,
Yeah.
leaving emptiness and depression in its wake. And when I watch, so many women are on some form of antidepressant, and how much of that is connected with the depression that's connected with all that we are seeing happening in our name that is not about peace and freedom. That's the opposite of that. So my own work in contemplative practices and bringing that into the classroom is to try to find ways to keep our hearts open, to keep that jewel at the center of our chest, as Nazim Hikmet has described it, open, even as we're having to live through and listen to and witness so much destruction. So how do you keep your heart open when you know that the police are actually a military operation? What is the work that we need to do to keep ourselves open and wanting to be free beings, you know?
Right. No, I think, and I think that part of the work of teaching is really helping students to um, keep their hearts open and keep the innocence of vulnerability
Yeah,
intact so that learning can continue to have that flexibility and capacity to change their perspective. Because what I see in the K-12 system is that when you don't have that, that's when that rigidity sets in, and that's when that, us versus them, that the polarization that we're experiencing right now is the byproduct of that rigidity, is the byproduct of that fear and
yeah,
that mass anxiety that's being stoked because people have been indoctrinated,
yeah,
as I'm going to use the rights words for the left, indoctrinated into not holding on to that vulnerability, not preserving that childlike innocence for, wonder and lust for curiosity and magic of just being open to.
yeah.
And I mean, that's why I became an educator, was to make that possible. That's what I found in the classroom. And I only found it as an AP student, and having come into the system as a struggling learner, knew
Mhm,
that not everyone had that access, and
mhm,
knew that that was incredibly harmful to those folks who didn't have that access, and knew that those folks were Black and brown children,
yeah, yeah.
and knew that that was strangling my community,
Mm, mm, mm.
and yeah, and was enraged. And like, the crazy thing was, I was a product of magnet schools. So when I first became a teacher, I was like, oh, when I was going to school, I was like, oh, so pro magnet schools, until I realized, like, oh my gosh, they skim off the top. They take the kids like me and they promote them and they go, but who's left? Who's left are the kids who can't get in for whatever reason, not because they're not smart, not because they're not capable, but because they can't or are not willing to jump through the hoops
Mhm.
in the ways that I could and was willing. And they don't get access.
This is some of the some of the complexity of Du Bois's The Talented Tenth,
Yeah,
because when the talented tenth are then granted access to resources, they can also be used to say, oh, but you did it, so how come everybody else can't do it? And that's
right.
the piece of access really means being sure everybody gets, but this isn't rocket science really about how that would be made possible. Even if, for example, instead of public schools being determined in terms of their funding by the property tax in their city, if the property taxes were spread out so that every student gets the same amount of money regardless of the city or town they live in, that would already democratize the public schools in such a huge way. If property taxes were not the primary way we decide whether you get a gymnasium or not, right? That the capitalist piece in this is really deep. But I'm also
Yes.
thinking as you were speaking that a lot of the reason that I reached toward contemplative practices in the classroom was I wanted to be able to communicate with all the students in a heartfelt way too. In other words, it wasn't really about just giving them something, but for me to stay connected with them. And I'm thinking, yesterday we read Elizabeth Acevedo's beautiful book called Poet X. It's a young adult novel that's in the form of poems. And instead of coming in with this lecture, because I adore her work, which I had ready, I asked the students to choose one of the poems from the book about Ziamora, who's an amazing character who becomes a poet, to choose one poem and then speak to it. And we went around in a circle, and the entire class was that. And it was such an intimate, smart, vulnerable, intelligent, wise conversation that the students made possible. They let me listen in on the depth of their thinking about feminism, about racism, about empowerment, about their bodies, about the shame that they were raised with around their bodies, about the role of religion in that. And it's like, so it's not really for me about I'm going to help others. It's like I want to help myself to be in a deep way, in a deep connection with the students, so that we do this amazing intellectual work that also has some heart in it, you know?
Right. Part of it is also understanding who they are. Like that's how you learn who they are so that you can understand what their trajectory is and how to help them get there.
Yeah,
Because that's what teaching is. Because that's where you learn what their skill is, like what their skill level is, and you can provide and scaffold for them what they need
right.
in order to get to where they're going.
Yeah,
And that's what is lost, like what is so tragically lost in where we are right now in education. We're giving so much money to these testing companies, and we're not giving money to having more people in the classroom so that we
right.
have more intimate connections to the children in the classroom so that we can do this work
Mhm.
better because the children need the people. I mean, we have kids who are in classrooms who have ACE scores of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, whether we want to admit it or not. And they need human to human interaction. They don't need a test score of
Right, right,
whatever. They
right.
need person to person human interaction to stabilize their immune systems, their nervous systems, to regulate, to get that attunement that they're not getting otherwise. That
Mhm.
will actually help them to learn better, to
Right.
be better, and to make us better as
Yeah.
a society, as a community, as a society, as a world. And
Mhm.
we're giving our money to corporations.
Yeah, I had this conversation last semester because I was noticing that not as many students are coming into office hours as used to be. Ever since COVID, it used to be if I put up a sign up sheet, they'd come in 15-minute slots and all afternoon I'd see students, and now I don't so much. So I was like, what's up with that? Do I not have the kind of, I don't know, the openness that I did? Do you not see? And what came out in part is that they are afraid to come to their professors if they don't know enough. And they would rather ask Google or they would rather ask
Ask
AI
AI.
a question than to come to me. So my thing was, yes, but that cuts out the mystery because if you come, there might be something we talk about that you wouldn't even know to ask. And I might be able to say something that's never occurred to you before. So one of the students said, yes, but I've been working with AI for several years, and I trust AI more than I trust an adult. Now, I really had to listen to her because this is what we're dealing with now. a fear about interaction across generation, and a trust for artificial intelligence that moves us away from human contact and vulnerability. And I worry for that because what I see is more fear and I see more reticence. I see students come into class 20 minutes early so they can actually be together, but then they're on their phones instead of actually having conversation. And so some of the work is to model that I need to know them, that I myself, they might not think they need to know me, but I need to know them, that I'm lonesome for them, that I care about actually knowing them on some kind of whole level, right? So it might not be that they think they need me, but I need to be way out there. In order for me to keep teaching, I need to be able to have, it's not about AI for me. It's about you. It's about your heart. It's about your intellect. It's about your needs. It's about your vision for the world. That's what I want to know. And I don't want to presume that, so you got to tell me. Yeah. I don't know how successful I've been about being able to to convey that. But when I feel inadequate, then we look to the texts, right? We look to poetry, we look to music. One of the things I do now a lot is when we analyze an essay or we're looking at a book, I'll say, what's the soundtrack for this book? What are the songs? And everybody loves music on some level. And so we put together, and I say, who's your sweet honey in the rock? Wait, who is your sweet honey? Because Sweet Honey in the Rock for so many of us growing up was like how we went to church, how we went to temple, the amazing, acoustic started by Bernice Johnson Reagan. And it's like, who's your sweet honey now? And they'll share with me music. And there's something that opens up when we have music going on in the classroom as well.
While you were talking, I was wondering, you keep referencing like you need this for yourself. And I wonder to what degree are you allowed to say that out loud in a way that I've never been able to say that? Because I know that all of the work that I've always done in the classroom as a teacher or as a school leader has not been, I'll just say, well received.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you have developed this practice over the years. And I think we should probably back up because like we've extended this conversation well past like even explaining where it came from.
Right.
How you've developed this practice and have been, to develop a practice, it has to have been affirmed in a way that has been affirmed. And even though, when we had our prep conversation, you said like it's not something that you advertise where you are now, but at some point, you have been recognized for it and you are comfortable in that practice in a way that I've never been allowed to be.
Yeah. Well, I do think that race plays a role in what is possible.
Mhm.
But I also know that I have more freedom talking to you honestly because of the respect that you have for the writing, for example, than I am able to be with most of my colleagues. We talked about this some, teaching with tenderness. I wrote and I hid in my closet really until my best friend pulled it out during one of my breaks and said, I want you to look at this. I want you to see what you got here. And it wasn't until an editor said, hey, I'm interested in this, that I came forward because I had been reprimanded, police, surveilled many different times to the point where I've learned to be quite under the radar with what I do in the class. Because it's seen as hokey pokey, it's seen as touchy feely, it's seen as not serious. So I definitely make that there are 7 books on that first year course that I'm teaching that has Elizabeth. I mean, there's ways I've had to protect myself too, to let people know, yes, it's possible to do contemplative practices and be intellectually rigorous. That they can also do a ton of writing and they can do a lot of reading and we can giggle on the floor after we've all done down dog and done, Herbie Hancock's Imagine, it's possible. But do I talk about this openly with my colleagues? No, I don't. And do I dread if something is referenced in one of my teaching evaluations that suggests that somehow what we're doing is not a, yes, I still fear for that. And I think also as out lesbian, and I have been for a long time as a queer woman, I'm still seen as somehow the predator. And
Mm.
a black feminist friend of mine finally said to me, that's what people say is that in the classroom you're like touchy, you're like, and that's like, oh my God, it's the last thing that I am, right? But that's the homophobic perception that I still have to confront and deal with. There are some ways that race has allowed me to do things, but the lesbian piece and my own vulnerability as a trauma survivor has also led me to be quite reticent. I don't think my colleagues have read Teaching with Tenderness,
Yeah.
right? It's outside, and that I think a lot of us face that. We get support. You're calling me up and saying, hey, let's have a conversation about this. You don't know how much that means to me.
Oh,
Seriously.
it's a beautiful
Seriously.
book. It's a beautiful book. It is such a beautiful book. And Matt, I'm gonna cry now because it is everything that should happen in the classroom. It should be practice everywhere. We would be better as people, we would be better as a society if it was the practice of the land and the brokenness that we experience in our families as this thing we have this great thing called public education that we all have to go to and it has the power to be a restorative place
Mhm. Yes.
if we did this, if we did more of this.
But I mean, I think you raise an important point about given racism in this country and sexism, how do women of color find ways to be your whole selves and to push the envelope in terms of creative practices and not get creamed and still have jobs? Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
troubling question.
Yeah, well, yeah. When I figure it out, I think I'll be a millionaire. Um,
That's your ticket. Okay.
right. But yeah, I don't know. But I appreciate you sharing. My follow-up question to that is then with all of that, how do you keep enduring? How do you keep going?
I
That's
still feel that that this is the work I am here to do, but also what I think of as teaching has gotten bigger over, we typically think of teaching as what goes on in traditional classroom settings, but I'm just thinking, for example, working with a translator, two translators when teaching poetry in refugee centers in Greece, and having people who speak Dari and Farsi and Arabic and French all in one class as we are working together on Audre Lorde's A Litany for Survival that was translated by um, an Afghan professor. I'm thinking about the enormous challenges and the gifts of being able to be in those spaces. And I'm thinking about teaching yoga at China Women's University as a visiting scholar. And because there was worry about, well, what's yoga really? We taught it outside. We held the classes on a basketball court, right? So the basketballs are like flying this way and that way, and they're running around the track because in China there's a lot of emphasis on people getting a lot of exercise, right? So I feel fortunate to have been able to bring these contemplative practices and the joy that they bring to multiple spaces, so that I'm not dependent on these oftentimes clumbered, fearful places as my validation for being a teacher. That
Mm.
I have a bigger world than an academic space that is not often about the liberation of us as people. Yeah,
Oh, that's beautiful. Um, that's beautiful. That in its own form is your self-care.
yeah, that's right.
That's where you build resilience.
Yes. I mean, I think walking with people who had risked their lives to save their lives, coming across from Turkey to Greece, across a very perilous sea, the Aegean Sea, and then that moment of witnessing birth and death, right? The death of their lives as they lived it, and the birth because they had survived it. And then walking across the island of Lesbos with them because there was no public transportation that would take them, right? I swear my spine grew. Just being with people of that fortitude and that resilience and being able to witness that day after day, I am incredibly lucky to have had that. It's like what I was saying about, being raised up through multiracial feminism, where so many women of color were standing up against multiple different oppressions. That's what gets inside of our bodies and keeps us going. But also, this, you know, I cry a lot, right? I get really low about the state of the world and lonely as well. Lonely because there's so many barriers to deep intimacy, right? And loneliness from the people that I've lost as well. And somehow being able to talk about that and not hide it. And to know when I say I get lonely and you sit up and you're right there, I'm lucky. I'm lucky.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, I would like to offer you a few moments to share a poem or two.
Oh, great. Great. So, well, there's many I'd love to share because they really did come from people that I walked with. But I thought I would do this one called A Litany Travels, and it's from Audre Lorde's A Litany for Survival. That's the title. And it speaks to the complexity of trying to teach. So, A Litany Travels. The translator says, let's turn to a litany for survival. We'll say it first in Dari, then English, all together. Ready? Did I mention that I'm over my head? Or perhaps my head continues to fly about, but my spine has folded in.
Mm.
When did this accordion behavior begin? Was it when we had chairs for 15 and 25 came, not counting the children? Or was it when I passed around an attendance sheet that came back with 6 signatures?
Mm.
Fear had buried their pens. Was it after we read a haiku and a father said, how can we write pretty poems? Our lives are not pretty, as his 3-year-old daughter drew on her arm with a purple marker? Or was it when I couldn't outline the basic shape of Afghanistan on the board? Someone came up, drew his country and all the ones that touch it.
Mm.
Was it when the shutters we opened so the small room could breathe kept banging, each time pulling people from their chairs? An elder man rose and gently closed the shutters. Or was it when a teenager clutched her friend, sandwiched between men like fish, said she liked the poem about memories and backpacks, wished it was in Somali? I said, me too. Or was it when the father explained his family receives €300 each month? If they're granted asylum, that will end after 6. Or was it when I was sure 2 teens who stared into their phones were there for the free bus tickets until they recited, brilliant land days in Dari and English. They wrote them with Google Translate. What about the 7-year-old who answered all my questions in English before the adults, their eyes stuck on the table floating with cherry pits left by the 4-year-olds? There is no childcare at this refugee center. Parents hold their children close, won't let them go farther than their side vision. Their eyes reach in all directions. The Afghan filmmaker declares, "I'd rather not hear the word refugee ever again." He asks, what would happen if every time you hear the word refugee, you whisper, no, shout the word people? What
Mm.
about the woman who, after I blah, blah, blah about writing to tell the truth, says, with all due respect, no one can speak honestly as long as we are here?
That is beautiful.
So all of the people I got to work with were my teachers.
Yeah.
At best, I was a companion.
That is the true work of teaching.
So I'm now a godmother to a 15-year-old, and she chooses this poem when we get to read together. And she's doing incredible work at the International School of Boston.
Nice.
So this one would be for her, Arizu Kabuli. And it's in the shape of a funnel, but also in the shape of Batman's cape.
Oh, okay.
Just so you have a sense, it's a concrete poem. Ahmed talks to his 13-year-old brother. Remember, you are Superman with a hurt-proof cape. Don't forget your aunt nicknamed you Balloon, he who will float above danger. Learn to draw a map of Syria in ink on paper cups. Don't look at the sea if it makes you sad. Look at the sea and remember you made it. Be the song you sang on the raft. Don't run from ghosts. Use your backpack as a pillow, a seat, a table. Carry your prayer rug inside. It's okay to let the rug double as a bed. Eat meals with the young Palestinians. They've been through this longer than you have. Keep ironing your shirts even though you have to stand in line. Know your people are proud. Remember why they sent you first. Don't trade your toothpaste for cigarettes. Well, maybe sometimes. Don't sell your kidney to anyone, ever. Remember your uncle before the sniper. Be tall. Know you come from a people of maps and stars. Learn how to be a barber. Wherever you go, men will need their haircut. Don't drink bleach. Don't drink bleach. So that's about teaching. An older brother is teaching his younger brother how to survive even in a situation that is death dealing. Yeah. With humor,
Yeah.
with stories about his people.
Wow. One last question. If someone's interested in learning more about this pedagogical approach,
Mm.
where would you advise them to go next besides obviously your book, which I'm going to put in the show notes?
I think it's very helpful for teachers to also be students
Mhm.
and to always remember what it feels like to be in those little tiny seats. And so I would say go to wherever you need to be doing some learning or get to do some learning. So,
Mhm.
you and I were talking about you going and getting an MFA because, you're already credentialed up the yin yang, right? But there's something about being a student that I think reminds us about the vulnerability of that work and helps us as teachers as well, as much as we can be lifelong learners. I'm studying guitar now, and I just got my first electric guitar. And I'm like, oh my God, it is so hard. And it reminds me when I'm working with someone on their writing that it's humbling to start from scratch. Anything that we can do where our minds and our bodies are alive certainly wherever we can find a contemplative practice that speaks to us. But I'm not talking just contemplative practice in a narrow sense. Contemplative practice can be, ecstatic dancing,
Right.
and it can be running around in the rain. Yeah, it can be so many different ways that we release tension so that we can be freer beings. Yeah, that's what I would say. Where would you send people who want to do more of this embodied teaching?
I would probably say somatics. Right now, that's the water that I'm swimming in, and I can't get enough because it is a practice that I continue to learn more about, and it continues to open up so many different things for me. And it has so much potential. And I think it has so much potential to bring back into the classroom, and just little tiny things that you can do with students that's not hugely, it doesn't take a lot of time or effort or prep, but can be majorly impactful to changing the climate and the culture of the classroom, and preserving that vulnerability and that innocence, and bringing back that wonder and that openness, and being heart-centered, um, in ways that are truly impactful.
It's such great work you're doing in the world.
Well, thank you. I thank you.
It's true. Thank
So,
you for spending time with me.
oh, thank you for you are a gift, and this book is a gift, this text is a gift, those poems are a gift, so thank you. This has been another episode of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. Thank you, Dr. Becky Thompson, for this time and this conversation. If you enjoy this episode, please feel free to like, comment, share by all means. And thank you so much for your time. Take care.